Excellent. Thank you so much, Cheryl, for that introduction. Thank you, LCA, for allowing me to chat to you all today a little bit about the work I've been doing myself and my team for some years now. It's an absolute pleasure and honor to chat to you all. As Cheryl mentioned, my name's Kailen. I'm from an organization called KaiNav Conservation Foundation, based right here in South Africa, Johannesburg, South Africa. We're a non-profit environmental research and education organization. But me, myself, I am a conservation biologist, and I specialize in raptor ecology, conservation, and most recently, ecotoxicology. But today, I'll be talking to you a little bit more about what one of the foundation's most important projects, and also one of our longest running projects, and that's called the S.N.A.R.E initiative, which of course has to do with poaching, wildlife poaching in Africa. But before we get into the details of that initiative, I think it's probably important to take a step back and chat a little bit more about poaching in general, to give us a bit of context, right, and understanding of where the S.N.A.R.E initiative falls in the bigger picture. So probably the best place to start is asking the question, what exactly is poaching? And the simplest definition of poaching, especially online, well, what we can call it is illegal harvesting of wildlife, wild fauna and flora. That's as simple as it gets, right? So, in other words, the illegal collection and or killing of animals and plants. Now, that last part is very important because most people actually forget about the plants, and most definitions, especially online, refer to only animals. The killing of animals or the removal of animals from properties without the required permission or the permits. But in reality, there are many plant species throughout the world that are equally threatened by illegal harvesting or poaching. A great example of this in South Africa, particularly, is cycads. Cycad species are extremely popular with a lot of poachers. They're dug up and sold to collectors from all over the world. Now these plants are slow growing, and they reach very old, or they get very old, and that's what makes them so popular with these collectors, and actually is driven to many of these species to become critically endangered. And so it's important for us to remember when we talk about poaching, it's holistically, it's both animals and plants. But still, to this day, most people, not only in South Africa, but throughout the world, associate poaching with two main species. And that's, of course, rhinos and elephants. Now, it's understandable because as a community, worldwide community, we've been bombarded for decades with heartbreaking images of these majestic creatures being slaughtered for either their horns or their tusks. And because of this, this constant bombarding, awareness and fundraising campaigns have been exceptionally successful. They've reached all corners of the world. No matter where you go in the world, if you mention wildlife poaching, the first animals that come to mind are, of course, elephants and rhinos. And it's great. It is. Don't get me wrong. It's good to have this awareness, and funding. Of course, we've raised millions for the protection of these species. But with this success has come an unintended misconception, and that misconception is that these are the only species, or at least the major species, that are impacted by poaching, and with the result that many of the or very little attention, let's say, and effort has been expended on the more common species, common in inverted commas, that are equally, if not more, at risk from poaching, which is very sad. But with that being said, what can we say is the most common type or common form of poaching? The fact is, well, historically, most attention has been placed on elephants and rhinos. the most common type of poaching has nothing to do with horns or ivory at all. In fact, it doesn't even need or require high-powered firearms or sophisticated ammunition, none of that. The fact of the matter is that the most common form of poaching throughout both Africa and Asia uses simple pieces of wire, equipment that is so easy to come by and techniques that are so simple to follow that even children are being found taking part in this type of poaching. And of course, I am talking about snares and snare poaching. Now, there may be, I see there's quite a few people, not necessarily from South Africa, but other parts of the world that may not have seen or heard of a snare. No, don't stress about it. We're going to chat about it a little bit as we go along. We'll hear about what snares are, how they're used, get a better idea of what they are. Snares are very, they're quite versatile. They're made out of a huge variety of materials. You can see that picture on your left-hand side, or the far left, is actually a snare that's made out of plastic filament. This particular material comes out of a packaging. Basically, in South Africa, we get oranges, especially during citrus season. Oranges are packed in sacks, and that filament is one of the filaments that close up the bottom of these orange sacks, and so it's one of the most common ones we find closer to urban areas. The center picture that you see there is high tensile steel cable. Now, this cable is extremely strong. We find a lot of it in mining areas or any industry with heavy lifting or requires heavy lifting. This wire is able to hold a rhino very easily, and we've seen it in certain cases. So very strong material, usually used in areas with larger game species. And the one on the far right, the last picture that you're looking at, is just simple steel wire. Now, this wire in particular has actually been removed. It's been untangled from a steel cable, and the picture is a little bit deceiving. That is extremely thin. So when it's placed in the bush, it's very difficult to see. Easily confused with vines or grass, but it's used for smaller species, mainly hare and mongoose, things like that. But these are just 3 examples of the materials that are used. In South Africa in particular, and in areas of where we operate, we found that snares, the materials used, they basically change according to the region and the area that the poaching is taking place. So the closer to urbanization, so cities and towns, the more varied the material can be. We found material coming from fiber optic cable that was stolen out of construction sites. We found brake lines from motorcycles. We found plastic bags that have been woven into snares. So you can see it's a huge variety of materials. The further from urbanizations, the more rural the areas, the more uniform the snares become. And most of the time, the snares that you're finding in those areas are some sort of wire, some sort of metal cable. But all of them, no matter what material they're made of, has one purpose, and that is to catch and kill wildlife. And these wires are all they're stolen or very rarely bought, but mainly stolen out of properties, and they're tied into nooses or slip knots. So for those of you who can see me in the top corner of your screen, this is what I mean by a slip knot and a noose. This is a snare that I'm holding in my hands here, and you can see it kind of closes really easily. That is a noose. That is a slip knot. Closes really easily and opens really easily. And that's what these wires or these cords are actually tied into. The nooses are then placed over an animal part. So if you look at your screen, let me get a pointer going. Fantastic. So on your screen in front of you, you have a snare that has been set over an animal path. This is your animal path. Okay, it's leading down a hill towards a river, in fact, where the animals congregate for water. This snare here, this is the snare set over the animal path. The loose end, or what we call the tag end of the snare, is normally attached to a very sturdy anchor point, a tree, roots of a tree, maybe even a log that's been wedged between rocks, anything strong enough to hold the target species when it's caught. Now, this snare, this loop, this noose that they've placed over the snare, over the animal path, doesn't stay upright on its own. What poachers do is they use what we call snare stays. Okay, snare stays are basically mechanisms that keep the noose open. So in our operation or our areas in South Africa that we've been operating, we found two common snare stays. The first snare stay is quite simply a twig, a dry twig broken off a tree, sharpened at one end, and then pushed into the soil. Normally, they'll have one stay on either side of the path. So both of them will be pushed into the ground, and a slit is made on the top of that snare stay. The noose is then gently placed inside that slit. So the picture only shows one snare stay here, but normally there's another one on the other side. And that's all they need to keep that noose upright and over the animal path. This is one of the common snare stays that we find. The next snare stay is a simple dry blade of grass. Now, you can see in this picture here on your left-hand side, we've got a rather large snare. This was set specifically for larger game, eland, wildebeest, zebra. And what they've done is tied it, the tag end again, to a very sturdy anchor point. And the noose has been placed, in this case, not over an animal path, but rather in an area where animals are seen feeding. So this is a very shady area. We get a lot of very palatable grass growing under these trees. And the poachers have actually noticed this, and they've placed the snare in that area where the animals feed. In this case, we don't have those twigs as snare stays, but if you look at the right-hand quadrant there, which we've zoomed into here, it's just a blade of grass tied to the noose itself or to the snare and tied to an overhanging branch. Again, very simple, easy to come by, and that's all they need to keep that noose open. The noose simply sits open like that over the pathway, and the stays just need to be strong enough to hold it open until an animal is caught. The minute an animal is caught, those stays break away, and the snare is able to tighten. Now, how this works is, I'll go back to my snare that I have set here. Animals generally use the path of least resistance, so animal paths through the bush. These paths generally lead between foraging areas or to and from watering holes. And as the animals are walking down it, the poachers will place the snares over those paths. But the snare is placed over the path in an area which we call a choke point. Choke point is quite simply a section of the path which animals are forced to go down. So there's either some sort of obstacle on either side of the path which prevents the animals from veering off that path. So it could be a thick bush, it could be a cliff face, it could be anything that forces an animal down that path will be contributing to that choke point. The snare is placed over that choke point, over the path in that choke point. As the animals pass down that path, the snare either slips over their neck, over a limb, a leg. Sometimes in certain cases, if the animal is moving fast enough, it slips over the entire body and catches the animal across the abdomen in certain cases. And the reason this snare is so successful, or these traps are so successful, is that it uses the animal's natural instinct to move away from danger against it. Okay, so as the animal feels the snare against its body, the animal will pull away from it. You can see that noose starts to tighten. As soon as the noose feels tight around the animal's body, it starts to panic. And the more the animal thrashes, the more the animal struggles to get away, the tighter that snare gets, until The animal just cannot move anymore. This nest bites on itself like this, and it doesn't release on its own. You need to have thumbs to kind of open that noose up, and that's what makes this trap so successful. Most animals that are caught in them, unfortunately, succumb to these snares, and it's quite a regular occurrence. Now, while I speak about snares and snare poaching from our perspective here in South Africa, it is by no means isolated to South Africa. In fact, it's no means isolated to Africa. It's the most common form of poaching found throughout both Africa and Asia. We do know that snares are used legally in certain parts of the world. In certain parts of North America, there are permits that you can buy to have these snares and set these snares. But in Africa and Asia, they're used primarily for or in the bushmeat trade. They're associated with bushmeat. But what is bushmeat? Yeah, and probably more important, what is the difference between bushmeat and venison? You know, we all heard of venison. We go to our butchers, we go to our grocery stores, and we buy venison. Sometimes on a daily basis. So what is the difference between the two? Now, as discussed earlier, poaching refers to the illegal harvesting of wild fauna and flora, and this applies to the products from these poaching activities. So ivory, rhino horn, that's all, you know, those are products from commercial rhino and elephant poaching, which we'll discuss. We'll discuss that a little bit later in terms of commercial poaching. So in other words, the illegal or illicit product associated with snares and snare poaching would be meat, and meat specifically from wild animals. Now, this illegal meat is what we refer to as bushmeat, and that's the key difference between venison and bushmeat. You know, venison is obviously legally harvested. It follows strict protocols, strict vetting, and it's all the permits and regulations are in place when harvesting that meat. The structured and formal process is what's missing when we refer to bushmeat. Now, as I mentioned a second ago, there are two broad levels of poaching, and this applies to snare poaching as well. So we talk about commercial poaching and subsistence poaching. Now, each level is associated with different characteristics. Commercial poaching involves remuneration. So in other words, poachers are rewarded in some way for the illicit products that they generate from their poaching activities. So they're paid for the rhino horn, they're paid for the ivory, and in certain cases they're even paid for the bushmeat. That's when bushmeat is a commercial, or when snaring is commercial. This level of poaching is also generally very organized. It's well organized, and it's perpetrated by teams or gangs of individuals. A lot of the time it involves syndicates and many multinational syndicates. It's a very, very high level of organization in poaching. Now, subsistence, on the other hand, is the polar opposite. So besides being associated with bushmeat, snaring is generally associated with subsistence poaching. Now, subsistence poaching is, you can regard it as illegal hunting, right? Illegal hunting specifically for the pot, to feed themselves, to feed their families. In other words, the poachers are not remunerated, so they're not paid for that illegal product, for that illegal product or that meat. When they get paid, when they get remunerated, it becomes commercial poaching. Most of the time, this subsistence snare poaching is ad hoc. It's when it's needed. When people are hungry, they need food, they go out and they hunt for meat. And it's generally done by 1 to 2 people. And in many cases, especially here in South Africa, we find a lot of children taking part in this type of poaching. And a lot of these children, a lot of these people generally taking part in snaring don't realize that what they're doing is poaching. They believe it's hunting, it's purely for survival. And that is where KaiNav Conservation Foundation, S.N.A.R.E Initiative, was born. Now, S.N.A.R.E is an acronym, stands for Snare Neutralization, Awareness and Removal Effort. We've been operating in Gauteng, in Gauteng specifically for just over 9 years. and had the opportunity to work in KwaZulu-Natal, Northwest Province. We've even had the opportunity to head up to Uganda and work with some teams in the Kibale Forest on snaring and snare poaching. So it's been a project that's been around for quite a long time. It started off quite simply as a research and monitoring program. We wanted to assess the status of snare poaching in Gauteng and South Africa. We wanted to understand what is happening, where is it happening, why is it happening? Because, you know, at that stage when we first started, very little was known about snaring. Very few people understood it. As we went about our surveys, it soon became apparent that very little effort and resources has been set aside to address snare poaching in South Africa. And so it went from research and monitoring to locating and removing these snares as fast as we can before animals were killed, while still gathering as much information as we could. The more we did it, the more people we came into contact: landowners, conservationists, students from schools and universities. And we started to realize people just do not understand what are snares, what are they used for, you know, and again, people didn't realize that the impact this type of poaching was having on species. And so our removal efforts became education programs where we would take students, both school students and university students from South Africa and from universities around the world, from the United States, tourists, basically anybody that was interested in learning more were coming out on our education programs, learning about poaching, learning about snares in particular. And of course, staying true to KaiNav Conservation Foundation's initial goals and objectives, we started to build a database and we gathered as much baseline information on snare poaching as possible, materials used, placement characteristics, environmental characteristics, GPS coordinates of each snare. And we started to build a database that we as the foundation could use to use in our own operations, but also share with other organizations, conservation managers, provincial and national conservation authorities, in an effort and an attempt to promote proactive conservation as opposed to reactive conservation when it comes to snares and snare poaching in South Africa. Now, we've spent the last 23 minutes or so talking about the impacts of snares and snare poaching on wildlife and the environment. And we all know that when it comes to poaching in general, most people around the world focus almost entirely on animals. And we're all incensed, right? We all hate the cruelty and the waste of life that comes with poaching, and particularly snare poaching. Sometimes it's embarrassing to say, but we even start to talk about imposing unrealistic and just ridiculous punishments for the culprits. But when I talk about the forgotten victims, I'm actually not talking about the animals at all, because they're not forgotten. We talk about that all the time, and that's what we focus on. Who we do tend to forget about are our communities. The victims are our people, communities and people that are all too often excluded from the benefits derived from our natural resources, not only here in Africa, but throughout the world. And poaching is not an animal problem. It's a human problem. And in fact, we need to stop looking at snare poaching as a problem and rather recognize it for what it is. And that is a symptom of a much larger problem that needs to be addressed. And of course, that's poverty. Poaching, whether it's commercial rhino poaching, subsistence poaching for survival, poaching happens for one of two reasons, right? The need for money or the need for food, or sometimes even both. And poverty is the key driver that we find driving snare poaching in particular here in South Africa. There's entire communities that cannot afford basic food. And Therefore, they turn to snare poaching for survival, to feed themselves, to feed their families. And a lot of these families that we speak about are child-headed households. They do not have a formal and structured and sustainable source of income. And so they have no other option but to hunt for food. And we need to remember that when we're addressing poaching, specifically snare poaching, but poaching in general, we need to remember the human aspect of wildlife poaching and plant poaching. Now, besides it being a difficult activity, snare poaching is extremely dangerous. There are so many reports of poachers being killed by the animals that they're hunting. Recently, in fact, we received information of a poacher that was mauled to death by a hyena that he had recovered from his, or he attempted to recover from his snare. And a lot of people would cheer at that and feel very happy about it. We need to remember why that poacher was in that position in the first place. We cannot forget our humanity. Besides the wildlife and the danger of being attacked by wildlife, there's of course anti-poaching units, teams that are out there day and night looking for these poachers. The activity that they're taking part in is illegal at the end of the day. So there's always a chance of being arrested. And probably the most concerning danger or threat from poaching is of course illnesses. Potential illnesses that doesn't just affect our communities taking part in the poaching, but communities outside of poaching areas where these diseases can spread to. Communities living and surviving off of bushmeat face a constant threat of eating infected meat. And remember, this meat is not vetted. It doesn't go through that structured process. So we don't know what animal is infected, what disease these people may be, or communities may be contracting from it. Ebola is a perfect example of a game disease linked to the illegal bushmeat trade, and it affects not just those communities, but everybody around when we have these big outbreaks. So again, the human aspect needs to be remembered, and you can see that snare poaching and other forms of poaching is extremely complex. There's no one-size-fits-all solution for this issue. And the bottom line is that poachers are not necessarily the devil. We need to remember that. And it's a bit of a controversial comment to make, and I do often get people that aren't very happy with me saying that, but it's true. They're not necessarily the devil. Most of them are quite simply trying to survive the only way they know how. Now, it's up to us as scientists, conservationists, and even just plain enthusiasts, wildlife enthusiasts, to find a way to help these individuals and these communities make better decisions. It's our duty, it's our responsibility. One of those ways is community development. Okay, and that's where it comes in. Many organizations around the world have found and developed different ways and programs to help lift these communities out of poverty, with an idea that if these communities are given an alternative means to earn a living and feed their families, most will turn away from poaching. Not only turn away from it, but actually actively help conserve species hand in hand with conservationists. At KaiNav Conservation Foundation, we've developed our own community program called the S.N.A.R.E program, in which we contract local community artists to turn the snares that we remove from the bush into inspiring pieces of art. These community artists get the opportunity to earn some sort of living or some sort of money doing what they love. They really do enjoy working with their hands. They're artists, and they're very proud of the products that they create. And each piece that they make spreads awareness. These pieces have been shipped all over the world, spreading awareness about snare poaching in Africa, spreading awareness about the illegal bushmeat trade, and also spreading awareness about the community programs that Africa has to offer. It spreads hope that from something as ugly as a snare, as a trap meant to kill animals, we can still create beauty and inspire others. Now, with that, I'd like to say thank you all so much for giving me the time to chat to you about snares and snare poaching. I hope you've learned a little something from this talk, or at least have a different idea, different understanding, not only of snare poaching but of poachers themselves. And remember, we cannot conserve wildlife and wild places without people. It's our job, it's our responsibility to find a balance to care for both people as well as wildlife. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. Kailen, thank you very much. Really inspiring and wise talk, bringing balance to the picture. Everybody, you are welcome to use the reaction tools at the bottom to attract our attention. And you can also use the chat to ask your questions there. Can also already refer you to a comment there from John Cooper regarding the use of high-tech technology there for identifying the age of animals that have been snared and assisting in the successful prosecutions there. I see that Kim has got a hand up again. I believe it's Emily there. Please unmute and ask your question.
Hi, Kailen. Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you very much for the talk, and it was really good. And your anti-poaching course with Wildlife Campus, you did that, right? Yeah, I did it as well, and my favorite part was the snares. And yeah, I just wanted to say thank you very much for the talk.
You are most welcome. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm glad you enjoyed the course. Yes, Wildlife Campus is a fantastic organization. I'm very honored that I was the moderator and editor on that anti-poaching course. So I'm glad you got through it and you enjoyed it.
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Kim. I saw a little red heart in next to somebody's name. Thank you, Kim. Lovely to have you on. And we're putting you back on mute. Jan, over to you.
Thanks, Chris. I see Becky. Becky, please unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question. Becky, we can't hear you. Can you please unmute yourself?
Okay, sorry. So can you hear me now? Oh yeah, thank you.
Go ahead.
I'd like to thank, it's less of a question and more of a compliment to Mr. Kailen, because I've worked with him in the past, and I'm hoping that we can work again in the future in removing snares. And I'd just like to say that I'm inspired by the work that he does, as I'm also pursuing a career that's similar to that. So I'd like to say thank you for all the work he's done for us.
You're welcome, Becky. Thank you so much for joining. I hope to see you out in the field soon.
Yeah, soon, sir.
Right. Becky, thank you for joining Kailen in the good work that he does. And we look forward to seeing you in a Game Rangers uniform one day, and inviting you to do a talk on unlocking nature.
That's long-term planning. That's good of you, Johan. Thanks, Becky. We're waiting for your talk. Thank you. Johan, I was just wondering, Kailen, you did give a demonstration, and I think Maret said you might do it again.
Was how a snare would work, right? So let me get it. There we go. So it's centered. This is a basic snare. Something that we've actually removed from the cradle of humankind. This is the noose, right? This is the noose here. You can see if I pull on it, it closes really easily, right? this is the tag end that I was talking about, the end of the snare that's tied to the tree or a log or any type of anchor point. So when the animal, imagine this has been placed upright over an animal path. So as an animal is walking down this path, the noose either wraps around the neck or the leg, just like that, right? And the more the animal struggles, the tighter that noose gets. And you can see, I mean, that really, really digs in. I'm not even pulling very hard. That's actually quite soft. But imagine an animal struggling against the snare. They're going to really, really pull. They want to get away from this perceived danger. And the more they pull, the tighter it gets. So that was the basic demonstration I wanted to show you guys.
Wow, that makes the mechanics of it very clear. I see we have quite a few comments in the chat. Christine from TUT commenting, thank you so much for the talk. This was really inspirational for me as a young TUT student. Katie Williams, thank you for the talk. Please, can you share information about the Snare database? Are you gathering information about snares nationwide? And how will the data be used?
Yeah, so the data that we've been gathering is wherever our operations are. It's mainly in Gauteng at the moment. We've got a few data points in KZN and Northwest Province. It's basically, it's baseline data. So we're talking about placement characteristics. How are these snares placed? Where are they placed? You know, using the GPS coordinates to see their locations and their proximity to certain landmarks and land features to give us an idea. You know, can we pick up trends from the placement of these snares? The idea behind it is to, number one, find out, you know, which areas are, or which animals are being targeted in which areas, number one. Number two, if we can pick up trends on the placement of these snares, we can apply it to other areas which haven't been surveyed, and it cuts down your location time. So you can imagine, you can walk through the bush for hours on end and come up with not a single snare. Doesn't necessarily mean that they're not there, but it's just very difficult to find them. So with the information that we gather, if we can pick up these trends, we can pinpoint these snares a lot easier and a lot quicker, cutting down man hours and making your searches a lot more efficient.
Okay, a question from Laura. Do you at all work with a NGO called Snare2Wear? And that's just kind of, she wants to make you aware of that opportunity.
Yeah, there's we don't work with them. I have heard of them. That's the biggest issue that we've been finding with snares in South Africa right now. There are individual groups. There's also individuals that are looking for snares and removing snares. And the idea of everything we do is trying to formalize all these operations and kind of link everybody together, so we're doing the same thing in the same way. So that we can maximize on our data collection, make it standardized, so that the information that we're getting out of it is meaningful, and that we can use it as a larger community to make, again, I mentioned proactive decisions as opposed to reactive decisions. And that's the idea for this project, is to link everybody up so that we're doing the same thing. Because it's not that no one is doing anything. There are people doing things all over the country. We're just not aware of one another, and we're not aware of, a lot of the groups are doing it purely as a removal effort. You know, people hate seeing animals getting caught in snares, so they're just removing it. But there's a lot of data that we could actually generate from each incident that'll help us make better decisions in the future.
Sure. Kailen, do you also gather data on not financial, but the way that local communities might be affected in terms of their as a resource, losing a resource in terms of poverty alleviation?
Mm-hmm. We haven't been collecting that type of data as yet. The possibilities are are endless, actually. For us to, we had a student at one stage that started a project, I think it was for their honors or their masters, and they started gathering a little bit of information, and it really did open up our eyes to the possibilities. Those types of studies are extremely important, and yet something that we would like to look at in the future.
A lot of work to be done. Claudia from Spain is saying hi, greetings from Spain.
Okay.
Yeah, and she's thanking him for the talk. So thanks, Claudia, all the way from Spain. You're welcome to come in and just show yourself, and you can say to Kailen, thanks in person. Liesel van As, over to you. You ready, Liesel? You're on live.
Okay, we're just stalling. I'm going to be a little bit the devil's advocate tonight. Aren't we sort of ignoring the fact that we're still in a hunter-gatherer situation with a lot of people on the entire continent and in the entire world? And then also, what is the commitment from government? I mean, people are poaching food because they're hungry. How much is government involved into all of this?
You're absolutely correct, Liesel. You know, I can't speak for government, obviously, but from our experience, we've had very little buy-in to this program from a governmental standpoint. You know, we've dealt with individuals from different local, let's say provincial and national authorities, and from an individual standpoint, very, very positive and very, very supportive. But again, it's just individuals from those organizations. From an entire government, from our experience at least, very little commitment. In terms of the hunter-gatherers, the comment, absolutely right. What we need to remember is snare poaching is quite simply traditional hunting, right? It's something that has evolved with our indigenous peoples over generations, and that is why a lot of these people that we come into contact with do not actually realize what they're doing is poaching. A lot of them, their first reaction is, I'm not poaching, I'm not looking for rhinos or elephants, I am hunting animals to eat. For them, it's not poaching. They do not understand it. And so we are falling short with the education on what poaching is. Why is it illegal? Because that's, you know, for somebody that is starving, for them to understand what they're doing is illegal is very difficult. You know, why are we saying don't do this? Why do we suggest that you rather find an alternative? And also, again, that comment right there can be quite insensitive. It's not as easy as, oh, just find an alternative. You know, these projects are being implemented and carried out by privileged individuals, me included. I cannot truly understand the level of desperation somebody needs or somebody has or experiences to go out into the field and poach animals for a living or for survival. And so we need to take that into account, and we need to push for community education programs to help the people understand not only that it's illegal and that it is in fact poaching, but also the health implications of what you're doing. We do not want people to get sick, and this is where the human side of poaching comes in. We need to be dealing with that a lot more.
Thank you. Thanks, Kailen. Liesel, you are an excellent devil's advocate. Cheryl, please go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, Kailen, once again, thank you. It was an amazing evening, again, and an amazing talk.
You've been to Indumu and you've seen the poaching firsthand at Indumu. You've seen the hunger, you've seen the starvation, and it's just a comment that I firmly believe what you guys are doing is the education, and we have to start changing the curriculum 100%, because we've got to start including that into the school curriculum, because we've got to start educating the youth. And that's what we're doing, but it's still not strong enough. But I think through education and through community development programs and skills development programs, we could bring this around. And I think they're starting to understand what poaching really is. It's not just the matter of putting meat on the plate, because remember the one old man that was at the workshop, he started crying and he said, for all these years, I mean, he was 88 years old. And he said, after all these years, he thought he was just putting meat on the table. But today was the first day I realized what I was doing was wrong. So that's why education is crucial, and we mustn't give up on what we are doing. And we have to just emphasize and make our programs stronger and stronger and develop them according to the target groups. So we have to start with the younger age groups and move up. And we can't forget the adults. But thank you, Kailen. You guys are doing amazing work. Thank you.
Thanks, Cheryl. Thanks. You know, you mentioned that story. I'll share one with you quickly. Is I had a student that came on one of our Snare education programs that we run for schools. And this child was he was a teenager, probably around 15, 16. And he was originally from rural KZN, but he's schooling in Johannesburg. He's got a bursary and he's schooling in Johannesburg. And he came with us on this as part of a group on our program. And he spent the day with us looking for snares and learning about what snares are, what poaching is, and understanding, the whole thing. And at the end of the talk, at the end of the excursion, he had this look on his face. You could see something was wrong with this child. I didn't know if he didn't agree with what we were doing or he was upset about something. So I pulled him aside and I asked him. I said, "Is everything okay? Do you have any questions?" And he said to me, "We do this. I do this. When I go on holiday back home after school, for our school holidays, I go home and we set snares to catch food, to eat. And we do it because my father taught me and his father taught him and my great-grandfather. It's been passed down from generation to generation. Never once has anybody spoken to me and told me about what this is doing to wildlife and what this is doing to the environment as a whole. Am I a bad person?" And it was heartbreaking to hear that this child came to this realization that what he was doing was actually illegal, and now he feels that he's a bad person. And so we said to him, "No, you're not a bad person. Do you understand what we've been saying the whole day and why this is bad, not only for the environment, for your health?" He says, "Of course." I said, "Well, what are you going to do?" He says, "Well, my next holiday, I'm going to have a word with my friends and my cousins, and I'm going to go and remove snares in my community." That is what we need to strive for in every rural and urban school in this country. That is what we need to have. Again, it comes down to my point of poachers are not evil people. They're people that have not had the opportunity to learn what we have learned. And we need to approach poaching and poachers with that mindset. Gone are the days where we walk through communities dressed in battle-clad with rifles and bulletproofs and force confessions, and that is not what we need to be doing. We need to be people. Just because we love wildlife and wild places doesn't mean we have to hate people. That is the opposite of what we should be doing. And so, yes, Cheryl, it needs to come into school yesterday.
Thank you, Kailen. That was a profound answer. Roland Goods from Angola, please ask your question.
Good evening. Okay, first of all, just some background. I'm ex-Natal Parks Board. Then I left the Parks Board and took over from Ian Player as director of the Wilderness Leadership School. I've been in Angola now 20 years, running a national park, Kasama, which is 1 million hectares, and then Luwengi, Luana, Mavinga, which collectively is 94,000 square kilometers. Just a couple of points. I think that we tend to homogenize the African landscape. What's happening in KwaZulu-Natal is very different what's happening in Bobwata National Park or Luwengi, Luana. There are a couple of issues that one needs to take in consideration when you look at the illegal removal of whatever, plants or animals. And also you need to understand that a lot of what we're talking about is illegal are fairly recent Western concepts. The monitoring of whatever harvesting, whether it was water or the burning of grass or the harvesting of an animal for a meal, was to a large degree regulated by tribal traditional structures. What has changed is two things, as I see them. Well, there's probably more, but mainly two things. Human population increases, which has now brought them into conflict, and the other is the commercialization of the resource. In Kasama National Park, people have been killing a blue duiker for centuries. But when they started, that was one a month because they did it for a meal. But then it ended up as 50 a day to feed people, sell them in the market in Luanda. That became a very different issue. And also, you know, I think we've got to be very careful of imposing our Western value, because so often it's confused. We put it into a pot puree of moral, environmental, ethical, and we call it conservation, when in fact they're all different. So we've got to be careful and we need to separate them. So I work with San people, Barakwena San in Namibia, and they still are harvesting animals on a sustainable way, you know, and that has much less impact on the environment than us farming cattle in food lots and all the methane and all of the. But people have this idea that it is wrong for that guy, that San bushman, San man, to go and snare an animal, but it's okay for me to go to the supermarket and go and buy some leg of lamb or something that has far more impact because of the type of farming than that one guy snaring. Okay, then you can go into the moral or the ethical issue as, no, is snaring humane? Maybe it's better to shoot with an arrow. But, you know, we've got to move away from this very simplistic northern concept that has a very strong emotional. You know, when we were doing the campaign for St. Lucia, and Ian Player was asked, oh, but you're just emotional. And he said, yes, I'm very proud of being emotional. But there's a very big difference between emotional and just being a reactive. It's more than emotional. Well, it's not as worthy as emotional to the thing. So one's got to be very careful about how we deal with these things. Look at your background, where you live, how you live, and judge the people where you live against that. I mean, I worked in Ndumo, I understand, I work in Folozi. So we need to look at population regulations through education, and we need to look at the commercialization and the greed involved in bushmeat or rhino horn or ivory. And with my years of experience as a game ranger, I've learned that. And we need to be careful of the knee-jerk, you know, snaring is wrong. How is it wrong? How are we viewing it as wrong? In some circumstances, totally wrong. You know, you've got to look at, it's got to be regulated, otherwise there won't be anything left. If there are 1 million people where 100 years ago there was only one. Just a couple of observations in the sort of a longer term. But yeah.
Thanks, Roland.
I can
We'll stay in touch. Thank you. Llewellyn, you've got 3 minutes.
Well, thanks, so Kailen, thanks very much for the talk, and the comments so far have been absolutely superb. So mine's a bit more simplistic. I had a rather curious experience, Kailen, not that long ago. I've got a bush home just off the Crocodile River and the Kruger Fence near Komatipoort. And I was sitting on my deck one day, and there was a flapping going on not too far from the house, and it was clearly something in distress, and it continued, so it wasn't moving. So I went across to see what was going on, and it happened to be a guinea fowl that had been caught in the snare. But the snare, I just don't know how the snare could have been mounted. It was a very thin nylon cord, a thin nylon blue cord of about a meter long. It was attached to a grevia tree, a woody shrub, and it was around the guinea fowl's neck. Now, so I looked at this and I thought, how could this have been suspended? And I thought, I don't know how it could have got its neck into it. And then I felt, and we did actually see a person going past there a few minutes earlier. And I didn't think much of it. But then afterwards I thought to myself, well, maybe the person has actually tied the guinea fowl to the tree to come and retrieve it later, because I could not understand how this could have been mounted. Have you any idea what might have happened there? Because I still don't really know. I mean, I don't have any pictures to show you, but I just don't understand how a cord like that could get around the neck of a guinea fowl.
Yeah, guinea fowls, again, all these placements throughout the country, and that's what makes snare poaching so interesting. It's traditional knowledge that has been passed down through decades. So there's full placement characteristics that we haven't come across. I mean, it varies from region to region. We found here on the Highveld in Gauteng, there's the guinea fowls are targeted with nylon snares, like what you were talking about. It's normally those thin white nylon ones that you find in those orange bags. They seal up the bottom of the orange sacks, and they tie it if they wind it correctly and they just place it upright. They stand quite straight up without any type of stays on them. And I think it just comes down to the material that as long as it's a windless day, it can stand quite straight up if it's wound in the right fashion. But what we did find in KZN specifically is that the guinea fowl are targeted with fish hooks, where they actually attach fish hooks to a gut, fishing line, and they bait the fish hooks with maize, with mealies, and obviously the birds swallow that fish hook, and they catch them on that. So your guinea fowls, spur fowls, things like that are targeted with fish hooks and fishing line.
Interesting.
Yeah, and then just one more thing quickly, Chris. I had quite an experience a few months ago as well. I was in the bush doing a terrestrial ecological assessment, which is what I often do. And I was walking. Often I find old vehicle tracks, and they're very easy to walk along. Most of the time there's a heck of a lot of woody vegetation and difficult to get through. And I had this track in front of me. It's a very, very old track. You could hardly see it, but the grass was extremely tall. And sometimes when I walk through the bush, you might put your one foot on the base of a grass, and then you might put your other foot, and you might get your foot attached. The peduncle is the stalk, and then from the grass at the base, you put your one foot on the peduncle, and you put your other foot through the little loop, and you get your foot caught. So that often happens to me, but that's just the grass. And that day I was walking along, and I put my foot down, and I pulled forward, and something tightened around my foot. And I thought, wait, come on, this is a damn grass. I'm going to rip my foot away from this grass. And it tightened immediately around my leg, and it was in fact a snare. So I walked right into a snare. It's the first time in my life, having worked in the bush for many, many years, that I walked right into a snare. So it was quite an experience, actually. And I thought, heck, well, hang on, how am I going to get out of this? I don't have anything to cut this with. So I managed to extricate my foot from it, and then voila, as you were saying, it was the the wire went to a tree and around the tree. And yeah, so I've had the experience of actually putting my foot into a snare.
Thank you, Llewellyn, for your contribution there. Johan, I just want to see if John is still on. I see he's written in the chat about some research he's done. Maybe you could just briefly share that with us. John, are you still in? John and Margaret from the UK. Where's John? Can we see?
I'm still here. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Please share with us.
I'm sorry to put in something fairly technological. I loved the lecture. I thought it was super, particularly if you like the sort of natural history of it, and also the compassion about people who have to do this sort of thing because the plight they're in. I would say very quickly that here in Britain, snares are still legal, but they're about to be banned, we think. There's a code of practice. They're used for rabbits and foxes and so on. And so some of my study has been done here as well. All I was trying to say in my note was that the work I've been doing in East Africa, and it stems from work with gorillas some years ago, was partly to look at the wounds that snares inflicted. And of course, you can look at the wounds on a live animal that's still got a snare on it and you're trying to take the snare off, or in a dead animal that sad relate has died with the snare still intact. And some of that is in this article chapter I wrote. But the other thing which I should say the speaker may be interested in is when the snare, and this is in the protocol as well, if a snare is removed from an animal, if it's handled carefully, if you've got them, of course, in the bush, gloves and so on, you can also take samples from the snare, particularly the braided snare, wire ones that are very, very popular in East Africa. And then I can look at them down the microscope, stain them, and you can see what sort of cells there are. You can see if they're acute inflammatory cells, which means it's been on only recently on an animal, or more chronic ones, which would indicate that the animal has been struggling for some time, etc. And of course, for those who think DNA is God and God is DNA, I don't. I believe in God and I believe in DNA, but I think they're different. If you want to do DNA, you're welcome. But I must say my work looking down the microscope in the bush, I think our speaker and most of my colleagues who enjoy being out in the bush would like that better than just doing DNA in a lab in Durban or somewhere. But I don't want to get political. I'm just an old-fashioned field vet who likes doing things in the field and showing other people. But if the speaker and others are interested in these techniques that we've been working on, they're available. And I've put my email in and had a very nice message back from LCA that they'll keep it on file. And I'd be very happy to discuss it with them. And of course, as always, comments and criticisms of the protocol are welcome. I've talked much too much and I'll turn myself off now. Thank you very much.
As long as you don't turn yourself in, John.
Yeah, I'll let you into a secret, Chris. I didn't speak Afrikaans when I said dank u wel. I know some Dutch, and I understand you chaps down there speak a form of Dutch in the same way as the Americans speak a form of English.
Yeah, tell Kyle that he's sitting next to you. You might just get some trouble.
Yeah, I better get off the line because I've now upset the South Africans, the Dutch, and the Americans. Oh, never mind. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, John. We will pass this on to anybody who wants it, and obviously we'll also give it to Kailen. Kailen gets a verbatim report on the chat, so we will forward that to him. Thanks, John, and again, regards to Margaret. Just want to link to Roland Goods again. Roland, thanks for your comments. You know, it's also relative. I think that if you are somewhere, and now it's interesting that John says that at the moment they are now looking at banning the snares in the UK, because I assume that in the UK, it's not a lot of poor people only who use a snare to hunt. And so that's contextually a total different situation. And thinking earlier, I think it was Claudia, somebody came in from Spain. You know, if you live in wealthy countries, relatively wealthy, then there's a sort of ethos and there's a certain value system that there are certain no-nos. But if I think about the people who poach simply because they need food, subsistence poaching, so we have soup kitchens for poor people in the cities. And we try to reach out to those people somehow, and we understand that they are hungry, and we try and make a difference. But now when it comes to the subsistent poaching side, and you really work with, I mean, I keep on saying I've been traveling Africa significantly, and the poorest of the poor, and that was just their way of getting protein. It is, you know, it's all contextual, and there's just not a blueprint. We have to think innovatively depending the context and the situation. Just my little input there.
Isolde Viljoen, I would love to hear your question.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, thanks, Kailen. Amazing talk. I just want to know, out of interest, because I think that's the main thing, why, well, snares are so cruel. How often do you actually find animals still in the snare? You know, that people didn't have the opportunity to come and take them out and actually use the meat. Because recently I've been in Ndumo as well, and in one morning we saw 4 giraffes with snare, you know, injuries. So they obviously got out of it, or they got rescued out of it, but I mean the injury is there. And yeah, so how often do you actually see the animals just that died from hunger or suffocation or whatever?
So sadly, quite a lot. It's I would say between 2 to 3 out of our surveys, we're finding dead animals, at least one, in the snare. The sad fact is we've been running the program for just over 9 years now, in Gauteng, Northwest, KZN. I can count on one hand the number of live animals that we've found, or animals before they die or succumb. And that's the biggest problem, isn't it? Is the bycatch that we get in snare. I didn't touch on that on our talk, but bycatch is a huge issue. That's what makes it so unsustainable. And that's where we have that line of subsistence poachers, or poachers start off as subsistence, right? Their whole aim is to catch something to eat because they're hungry. But snares are really easy to come by. They're not a regulated material. You can find it anywhere, and it's very easy to use a snare. And so when they put out snares, they put them out in mass. And they just quite simply can't remember how or where to find them. And so the reality is we're losing a lot more animals than what we realize. I mean, I think there was a statistic at one point from one of the organizations, I think it was WWF, that we're losing more biodiversity to snare poaching every year than both elephant and rhino poaching combined. So it's a big problem. We just don't know. I mean, there's a lot of data coming out of East and West Africa, but literally nothing coming out of Southern Africa.
Johan, may I just ask, before you hand over to Cheryl, I just want to ask Sandra Hardy. I know that you told me that you do a snare program there in St. Francis. Something you would like to share with us on your experience in your snare program? Asking you to unmute Sandra, if you want to come in.
Education is paramount. And I wonder if we should be working under one umbrella to forward this education.
There's an idea.
It's always, again, a unified approach is always better, right? And unfortunately, I know many scientists have a terrible habit of not wanting to collaborate on projects. You know, we need to guard against falling into that trap. I am always an advocate for collaboration and working in one unified direction. So I completely agree.
how could we go about this? I would be very interested for our snare hunting group to join up. And Clive Horlock, sorry, is very much part of my snare hunting group in this area.
All right. Well, let's get into contact. I'm sure if Marit, you're welcome to share my the foundation contact details, Marit, and yeah, I think anybody like Sandra who wants to contact us, we can put something together.
Super. Thank you.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sandra. Cheryl, please go ahead.
Yes, I've got a comment, or just a few weeks ago, we did that snare cleanup with Bianca, her and her team, and they also found animals in snares, or I don't know whether, Kailen, whether you were with them when they actually did that last bit, and they found, I think it was springbuck, and they were all dried up, so they were still in the snares. And then they also saw wildebeest with snares on. It's a little bit scary that there's so many animals that are walking around with snares on. I'm not just talking about Klip-Riversberg, but it's happening there, and we see it weekly now. And it's before that, that's one of the reasons why Bianca got involved, was because her and her partner were walking on a trail, and they came across springbuck caught in snares, and the springbuck were already dead, but they were very, very fresh. So there's a huge amount of snares out in Klip-Riversberg. So if we can get more hands-on people to come help us clean up and to try and get those snares out of the reserve, it would help. Because Kailen, you did the most amazing talk there as well to try and get people involved. And it's on pathways, it's on trails, it's on animal pathways, it's everywhere, and it's scary. It's really scary.
Thank you, everybody, and thanks, Kailen, and wishing all of you not just a good night or a good day, purpose, meaning, making a difference.